The pit was finished, the bedrock was exposed, the underground river had been tamed, but nobody working on that site in March of 1930 could have imagined what was about to happen next, because what came after the foundation wasn't just fast, it was almost unbelievable. A building was about to rise into the sky faster than anything the world had ever seen, and it would do it while racing two other skyscrapers, while gambling everything on a hidden trick nobody outside the project knew about, and while asking men to walk across steel beams a quarter-mile above the street with nothing but nerve and balance keeping them alive. This is what happened after the ground was ready, how a hole in Manhattan became the tallest building on Earth. Let's step back into that site in the spring of 1930. The footings are poured, the first column is standing, and now the real transformation begins. Because up to this point, everything that happened on Fifth Avenue was invisible to most New Yorkers walking past. A construction fence, the sound of digging, maybe a curious glance down into the pit. But from this moment forward, the project would become impossible to ignore. Steel was about to start climbing into the sky, and it would climb faster than anyone walking past on the sidewalk could have believed. To understand why speed mattered so much, you have to remember what else was happening across the city at exactly the same time. Just a few blocks away, on 42nd Street, an extraordinary structure was already nearing completion. The Chrysler Building, with its gleaming crown of stainless steel arches, designed by an architect named William Van Allen, who had a flair for the dramatic that bordered on theatrical. And downtown, near Wall Street, another team of builders was racing to finish a tower simply known as 40 Wall Street, its height quietly creeping upward on paper every few months as its owners learned what their rivals were planning. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a public spectacle, closely watched by newspapers, argued about in barbershops and offices, a genuine obsession for a city that loved nothing more than a good competition. Reporters nicknamed it the race into the sky, and New Yorkers followed the story the way people today might follow a heavyweight boxing match, checking the papers every few days to see who was winning. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. William Van Allen, the architect behind the Chrysler Building, had a secret. Hidden inside the very top of his building, assembled in total secrecy inside the structure itself rather than out in the open where rival teams could see it, was a slender stainless steel spire. For months, competitors believed the Chrysler Building's final height was already locked in, already beaten by taller announced structures elsewhere in the city. And then in a single dramatic afternoon, workers raised that hidden spire up through the top of the building's crown and bolted it into place, instantly adding over 100 feet to the tower's height. In one stroke, the Chrysler Building shot past every other building on the planet, claiming the title of tallest structure in the world. It was theater, it was genius, and it was a direct challenge to anyone who thought they could outbuild William Van Allen. Team behind the building on Fifth Avenue watched this unfold, and they understood something important. Height alone wasn't enough. You needed a plan that couldn't be beaten by a hidden trick or a late-stage announcement. So while the tower was still just a skeleton of steel rising above 34th Street, the architects made a decision that would define the building's silhouette forever. They would add a mast to the top, not just a decorative spire, but something with a genuine, almost science fiction purpose. A mooring mast, a docking station in the sky, designed, at least on paper, to allow airships and dirigibles to tie up at the top of the building and let passengers disembark directly onto an observation platform more than 1,000 feet above the street. Picture the audacity of that idea for a moment. This was an era when air travel itself was still young, when Zeppelins occasionally floated across American skies as genuine marvels of engineering, capturing public imagination the way spacecraft would decades later. The idea of a passenger airship gently drifting toward the top of a Manhattan skyscraper, tethering itself to a mast, and unloading travelers who would then ride an elevator down into the heart of the city, sounded like something ripped straight from a pulp science fiction magazine. And yet here it was, seriously proposed, seriously designed, and eventually actually built atop what would become the tallest building on the planet. Whether the mooring mast idea was ever truly practical is a question historians still debate. The physics of trying to dock a massive, gas-filled airship to a fixed point atop a skyscraper, in the swirling, unpredictable winds that whip around tall buildings in Manhattan, presented enormous challenges that some engineers at the time quietly doubted could ever really be solved. But practicality wasn't really the point. The mast added height. Height meant records. Records meant the world's attention. And in the middle of a competition being fought as much in newspaper headlines as in blueprints, that mattered enormously. So the design was finalized, the height was set, and the building's ultimate target became clear, a structure so tall it would leave every other skyscraper in the city, and in the world, far behind. Now all that remained was actually building the thing, in a fraction of the time anyone thought was reasonable. This is where the true magic of the construction happened, not in the design, not in the competition with rival architects, but in the extraordinary choreography of getting steel, stone, and thousands of workers to move together with a precision that had never been achieved on a project of this scale before. Imagine the site as it truly was during those months. It wasn't chaos. It was closer to a symphony, if a symphony could be made of steel, sweat, and shouted instructions echoing off half-finished walls. The construction firm running the project had mapped out an almost impossibly detailed schedule, breaking the entire build into overlapping phases, each one planned down to individual days and specific deliveries. Steel beams forged in mills far outside the city were cut, shaped, and stamped with codes indicating exactly where on the building they belonged, then loaded onto freight trains and trucks, timed to arrive at the site almost the moment they were needed, not a day early when they'd sit uselessly cluttering the yard, and not a day late when idle crews would stand around waiting and burning through the project's precious schedule. At the base of the site, massive trucks rolled in constantly, delivering limestone quarried from Indiana, marble destined for the building's lobby, bricks by the hundreds of thousands, barrels of mortar and cement. Somewhere in the city, or arriving fresh off railcars, steel columns and beams weighing tons apiece waited for their turn to be hoisted skyward. It was, in essence, an assembly line turned vertical. The same principles Henry Ford had used to revolutionize automobile manufacturing, applied instead to the construction of a skyscraper, with materials flowing in a continuous, carefully timed stream, rather than in the start-stop, unpredictable rhythm that defined most construction projects of that era. And rising above all of it, climbing higher every single day, were the men who actually put the steel together, the riveting gangs. If there is one image that captures the spirit of this construction more than any other, it's the riveters. Teams of 4 men, working together in a rhythm so practiced it looked almost like a dance, assembling the steel skeleton of the building piece by piece, hundreds of feet above the ground, often with nothing beneath them but open air and the distant blur of Manhattan traffic far below. One man, called the heater, would take a solid steel rivet and heat it in a small coal forge until it glowed a furious orange, almost white-hot. Using tongs, he would then toss the glowing rivet, sometimes underhand, sometimes with a practiced flick across open space to a catcher, who would snag it out of the air in a metal can or with a pair of tongs of his own, moving with a casual confidence that still stuns people who see old photographs and film footage of the process today. The catcher would then hand the rivet off to a third man, who would jam it into a pre-drilled hole connecting 2 pieces of steel, while a fourth man wielded a pneumatic hammer, pounding the glowing metal until it flattened and cooled into a permanently fused joint, locking the steel together forever. This happened constantly, all day, every day, hundreds of feet in the air, on narrow beams sometimes no wider than a sidewalk curb, with wind gusting between the unfinished floors of the rising building. There were no safety harnesses in the way we understand them today, no comprehensive netting stretched below every work area. Men walked across exposed steel with a balance and nerve that seems almost unbelievable now, treating heights that would paralyze most people with an almost casual confidence born from skill, experience, and, frankly, necessity. Among the most famous of these skilled ironworkers were men from the Mohawk community of Carnawaik, near Montreal. Their reputation for exceptional balance and fearlessness at extreme heights had actually begun decades earlier, in the late 1800s, when a bridge project near their community required extensive high steel work, and Mohawk workers demonstrated an extraordinary aptitude and comfort for the work that left engineers and supervisors astonished. Word spread. Construction firms began actively recruiting Mohawk ironworkers for major projects across North America, and by the time this building was rising over Fifth Avenue, Mohawk riveting gangs were considered some of the most skilled, most sought-after high steel workers in the entire industry. Many of them would travel down from Carnawaik specifically for major New York projects, working alongside Irish and Italian immigrant laborers who made up much of the rest of the workforce, all of them moving together, floor by floor, in a shared rhythm of sweat and steel that slowly built one of the most famous structures in human history. The pace was staggering. On particularly efficient days, construction crews managed to erect an entire story of steel framework in roughly a single day and a half. Over the full course of the project, the building rose at an average rate of about 4.5 stories per week, a speed that stunned engineers and construction experts both at the time and in the decades since. To put that in perspective, modern skyscraper construction, even with vastly more advanced equipment, computer modeling, and safety technology, often moves at a slower pace than what was achieved here in 1930, using techniques that would look almost primitive by today's standards. How was this even possible? Part of the answer lies in that meticulous scheduling, materials arriving exactly when needed, crews organized with almost military precision, different specialized teams following one another up the building in a carefully choreographed sequence. As soon as the steel skeleton for a given floor was riveted into place, crews right behind them began laying floor decking. Behind them, workers started installing the exterior limestone panels and the building's distinctive stainless steel trim. Behind them, electricians began running wiring, plumbers began installing pipes, and interior crews began framing out walls, all of this happening simultaneously across different floors of the building at the same time, an army of specialized workers moving upward together like a wave, each group performing their specific task, and then moving on to the next floor while the group behind them began their own work on the floor just vacated. There's a particular story that construction historians love to tell about this period, involving 4 enormous steel columns delivered to the site early in construction, columns so massive they were destined to sit at the very core of the building and support a combined weight of roughly 10 million pounds once the tower was fully finished. These weren't ordinary beams. They were among the most critical structural elements of the entire building, engineered to bear a staggering portion of the total weight of everything built above them. Watching workers maneuver pieces of steel that enormous into precise position, hundreds of feet in the air in some cases, using cranes and hoists that were sophisticated for their era, but still required enormous skill and no small amount of nerve to operate safely, gives you a sense of just how much coordinated human effort went into every single piece of this building. Of course, none of this came without cost. This was dangerous, unforgiving work, carried out in an era with none of the modern safety regulations we now take for granted in the construction industry. There was no OSHA. There were no mandatory harness requirements, no rigorous safety inspections, none of the protective infrastructure that exists on construction sites today. Photographs from the period, some of the most iconic construction images ever taken, show workers casually eating lunch while sitting on exposed steel beams hundreds of feet above the street, their legs dangling into open air, seemingly unbothered by a fall that would have been instantly fatal. It's a striking, almost unsettling image when you really sit with it, ordinary men, doing an ordinary thing like eating a sandwich, in a position that today would be considered an almost unthinkable safety violation. Tragically, the human cost of this speed was real. 5 workers lost their lives during the construction of this building, according to official records from the time, though some researchers and historians have long suspected the true number may have been higher, given how loosely worker deaths were sometimes documented or reported during this era, particularly for immigrant laborers whose lives and identities weren't always carefully recorded by employers eager to keep projects moving and avoid negative publicity. Every one of those men had a name, a family, a reason for climbing onto that steel each morning despite the obvious risk. In the depths of the Great Depression, with unemployment soaring and financial desperation gripping millions of American families, a steady paycheck, even one that came with mortal risk attached, was often simply worth it. This building rose not just because of brilliant engineering and meticulous planning, but because thousands of desperate, skilled, and remarkably brave men were willing to risk everything, floor after floor, to build something extraordinary during one of the darkest economic periods in American history. As the building climbed past its 50th floor, then its 60th, then higher still, it began to dominate the Manhattan skyline in a way nothing else in the city could match. Office workers on their lunch breaks would gather on nearby streets, craning their necks upward, watching tiny figures moving along beams impossibly high above them. Newspapers ran regular updates on the building's progress, treating each new floor completed almost like a sports score, feeding a public appetite that had been building for months as the race into the sky captured the city's imagination. Tourists began visiting the construction site itself, just to see the spectacle in person, even though there was, of course, nothing yet to actually visit beyond a rising steel frame wrapped in scaffolding and construction fencing. Meanwhile, downtown, the team behind 40 Wall Street realized they had already lost. Their building, while impressive, topped out at a height that fell short of both the Chrysler Building's dramatic spire and the ambitions still rising over Fifth Avenue. And the Chrysler Building itself, despite its stunning secret spire victory earlier in the year, was about to be surpassed as well, not through any hidden trick, but through sheer scale and the addition of that ambitious mooring mast rising even higher above the frame of steel and limestone climbing toward the clouds. By the autumn of 1930, the steel framework had reached its full height, and construction crews began the final, symbolic phase of the project, topping out the building, formally completing its structural framework, followed by the installation of the mooring mast at its peak. Even as debate continued in engineering circles about whether the mast could ever realistically be used for its stated purpose of docking airships, the structure itself was completed with genuine seriousness, designed to withstand significant wind loads and structural stress, just in case anyone actually did attempt to bring a dirigible in for a landing at the very top of the tallest building in the world. As it turned out, only one attempt was ever made to moor an airship to the mast, and it revealed almost immediately just how impractical the whole concept truly was. Powerful updrafts swirling around the building's height, combined with the sheer unpredictability of wind patterns at that altitude in the middle of a dense urban environment, made any kind of safe, controlled docking essentially impossible. The idea was quietly abandoned, though the mast itself remained, eventually finding new purpose decades later as a broadcasting antenna, and of course, as one of the most recognizable architectural features in the entire world, forever associated with the building's iconic silhouette. By the time construction wrapped up, an almost unbelievable amount of material had gone into the building. 60,000 tons of steel formed its skeleton, 10 million bricks made up its walls, 200,000 cubic feet of Indiana limestone and granite covered its exterior, giving the building its clean, elegant, unmistakable facade. Over 6,000 windows were installed, allowing daylight to pour into offices that would eventually house thousands of businesses and workers. All of this assembled and installed in a construction period lasting roughly 410 days from the moment that first steel column had been set into its footing back in March of 1930. 410 days. Think about that number again and think about everything that happened within it. An underground river discovered and diverted, 57,000 tons of earth and rock excavated by hand and steam shovel, a race against two rival skyscrapers, one of them wielding a hidden spire as a secret weapon. Thousands of workers, including skilled Mohawk ironworkers, walking across open steel beams a quarter-mile above the street. Four-man riveting teams tossing white-hot metal through open air with practiced precision, and all of it happening while the country around them collapsed into the worst economic depression in its history. The building officially opened on the 1st of May, 1931. There was a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with dignitaries and speeches, and a switch was thrown that lit up the building's lobby and set its famous lights ablaze for the very first time. Standing at over 1,400 feet, including its mast, it instantly claimed the title of tallest building in the world, a title it would hold for the next 40 years, longer than almost anyone at the opening ceremony could have imagined at the time. And yet, for all its grandeur, the building's early years were surprisingly humble, even a little sad. The country was still deep in the grip of the Great Depression, and businesses simply weren't expanding or renting large amounts of office space the way the building's owners had hoped when the project was first conceived. Floor after floor sat largely empty for years, entire sections of the tallest building in the world dark and unused, leading cynical New Yorkers to nickname it, somewhat cruelly, the Empty State Building. It wasn't until the early 1950s, roughly 2 decades after its opening, that the building actually became profitable for its owners, the economic recovery of post-war America finally filling those long empty floors with the businesses and workers the original planners had envisioned. But profitability was never really the measure of what this building meant to the city or to the country. From the very moment it opened, it became something larger than an office building. It became a symbol, a statement built in defiance of economic collapse. Proof that ambition and human ingenuity could still produce something extraordinary, even when everything else around it seemed to be falling apart. Over the decades that followed, it appeared in countless films, becoming perhaps most famously the backdrop for a giant ape climbing toward the sky, in a movie that turned the building into a piece of cinematic legend in its own right. It became a place where couples reunited at the top of its observation deck in beloved romantic films, a symbol of longing and connection stretched across the entire city below. It became, quite simply, one of the most recognizable and beloved buildings on the planet, its silhouette instantly identifiable to people who have never set foot in New York City and likely never will. Today, more than 65 million visitors travel to the building's observation decks every single year, riding elevators up through steel columns, first set into place on a cold March day back in 1930, walking on floors built above a foundation that once fought off an underground river flowing quietly beneath Fifth Avenue. Very few of those visitors know that story. Very few of them think, as they gaze out over the sprawling city below them, about the hundreds of workers who dug through 57,000 tons of earth in the freezing cold of a New York January, or the riveting gangs who tossed white-hot metal through open air hundreds of feet above the street, or the Mohawk ironworkers who walked across exposed steel beams with a fearlessness that still amazes people who study this era of construction history. Or the 5 men whose lives were lost bringing this building into existence. But that story is there, buried in the foundation, woven into every column and every beam, as much a part of this building as the limestone on its exterior or the observation deck at its peak. It began with a hole in the ground. It began with a hidden river that almost stood in the way. And it rose, floor by floor, day by day, into one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, built not in an age of comfort and prosperity, but in the middle of one of the darkest economic chapters America has ever lived through, by men who simply refused to stop building, no matter what stood in their way. The year is 1930. In the heart of Manhattan, a hole in the ground is about to become the most famous construction site on Earth. But before a single steel beam rises into the sky, something strange happens underground, something the builders never expected. Workers digging through the dirt suddenly hit water. Not a leak, not a puddle. A hidden river flowing beneath the city, older than the buildings above it, older than New York itself. And for a few tense days, the whole project hangs in the balance. This is the story of what they found when they dug the foundation of the Empire State Building, and how a hole in the ground became the beginning of the tallest building in the world. To understand what happened in that pit, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a patch of land at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, long before anyone dreamed of skyscrapers scraping the clouds. In the late 1800s, this corner of Manhattan wasn't a symbol of ambition. It was quiet, residential, the kind of place where wealthy families built mansions and lived out their private lives behind iron gates and velvet curtains. One of those families was the Astors, one of the richest and most powerful dynasties in American history. And like most powerful families, they didn't always get along. Two cousins, both named Astor, both proud, both stubborn, ended up owning adjacent plots of land on this very corner. William Waldorf-Astoria built a hotel on his portion and named it the Waldorf. His cousin, not to be outdone, built another hotel right next door and called it the Astoria. The two buildings were physically connected by a corridor, but the family feud behind them was anything but friendly. Legend has it the two men despised each other so intensely that the connecting hallway became known as Peacock Alley, a place where New York's elite would strut and parade in their finest clothes, blissfully unaware that the hallway itself was a monument to a family rivalry. Together, the Waldorf and the Astoria became one giant hotel, the largest in the world at the time. It had over 1,000 rooms. It hosted presidents, foreign dignitaries, and the wealthiest families in America. Its ballrooms glittered with chandeliers. Its restaurants served food you couldn't get anywhere else in the country. For a few glorious decades, this was the center of New York high society. If you wanted to be seen, if you wanted to matter, you were seen here. But cities change, neighborhoods shift. By the 1920s, New York's social elite had drifted uptown, chasing newer, shinier places to be. The Waldorf-Astoria, once the crown jewel of 5th Avenue, began to feel like yesterday's news. The building was agging. The area around it was changing character, filling with commercial buildings and noise. The magic was fading. And when magic fades from a piece of real estate this valuable, someone eventually decides it's time for something new. In 1928, the land was sold. The buyer was a company with modest plans. They wanted to construct a 25-story office building. Nothing extraordinary, just another addition to the growing skyline of Manhattan. Nobody involved at that point imagined that this particular plot of dirt would soon hold the tallest building on the planet. Nobody imagined a race against time, a race against rival skyscrapers, a race against economic collapse, and a mysterious underground river standing in the way. That would come soon enough, because behind the scenes something bigger was brewing. A group of powerful men led by a former General Motors executive named John Jacob Raskob and involving a former New York governor named Al Smith had a much grander vision. They didn't just want an office building. They wanted the tallest building the world had ever seen. They wanted a monument. And in the strange, feverish atmosphere of the late 1920s, this wasn't just business ambition. It was a war being fought in the sky. You see, New York in the late 1920s was gripped by something historians now call the race into the sky. Several teams of developers, architects, and financiers were competing, quietly at first, then not so quietly, to build the tallest skyscraper on Earth. Downtown, a building called 40 Wall Street was rising, first planned at 840 feet, its ambitions growing taller by the month. Meanwhile, over on Lexington Avenue, an eccentric and brilliant architect named William Van Allen was designing the Chrysler Building, its plans shifting and inflating as rival projects grew. It was rumored, and later confirmed, that Van Allen had a secret weapon hidden inside the Chrysler Building's crown, a spire built in total secrecy, ready to be raised at the last possible moment to snatch the height record from any competitor who thought they'd already won. Into this chaotic, ego-driven competition stepped the team behind what would become the Empire State Building. They didn't just want to compete. They wanted to obliterate the competition, to build something so tall, so audacious, that no rival could hope to catch up. And they had a secret weapon of their own, not a hidden spire, but something arguably more powerful: speed. They intended to build faster than anyone thought possible, to raise a building of unprecedented height in a fraction of the time it would normally take. But before you can raise a building into the sky, you first have to go down, deep down, And in the fall of 1929, that meant tearing apart the old Waldorf-Astoria Hotel, piece by piece, brick by brick, until nothing remained but bare earth. Demolition began on the 1st of October, 1929, and almost immediately the crews ran into trouble. The old hotel had been built to last. Its walls were thick, its materials sturdy, its construction far more solid than anyone realized until they actually tried to tear it down. What was supposed to be a quick teardown turned into a grinding, difficult process. Every wall seemed to fight back. Every beam took longer to remove than expected. The costs climbed. The timeline stretched, and then there was the question of what to do with everything they pulled out of the building. Picture it, an entire hotel over 1,000 rooms, 16 stories of elegant Renaissance-style architecture being dismantled at a furious pace. Elegant granite blocks, ornate bronze fixtures, tons upon tons of wood paneling once polished to a shine in the hotel's grand ballrooms. Suddenly all of it was just debris, and somebody had to figure out where it would go. The wood was piled up on a nearby street and burned in a swamp outside the city. Much of the stone and bronze, materials that once decorated one of the most opulent hotels in America, were hauled out to sea and dumped unceremoniously into the Atlantic Ocean, sinking into the dark water off Sandy Hook. A hotel that had once hosted kings and presidents now lay scattered across a swamp and the ocean floor. There is something almost poetic about that if you think about it. The old world, quite literally, being cleared away to make room for something new. And then, right in the middle of all this demolition, on the 24th of October 1929, the entire country was shaken. The stock market crashed, fortunes evaporated overnight, banks collapsed, businesses shuttered their doors. The event that would come to be known as the beginning of the Great Depression tore through the American economy like a wildfire, and suddenly, building the tallest skyscraper on Earth didn't seem like the safest bet in the world. Many projects around the country were cancelled outright. Investors pulled back. Confidence evaporated along with people's savings accounts. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Instead of retreating, instead of playing it safe, the men behind this project pushed forward. Some later suggested it was stubbornness. Others believed it was a calculated gamble, that building through the crisis, rather than pausing because of it, would actually work in their favor. Construction costs and labor were about to become far cheaper as the economy crumbled, workers desperate for any job at all, materials priced lower because demand elsewhere was drying up. Whatever the exact reasoning, the decision was made. They would build. The crash would not stop them. By January of 1930, the demolition of the old hotel was still ongoing, but the builders could wait no longer. On the 12th of January, a massive contract was signed for the structural steel that would eventually form the skeleton of the tower, over 57,000 tons of it, an almost unimaginable quantity of metal that would need to be forged, shipped, and assembled with breathtaking precision. And just 10 days later, on the 22nd of January, 1930, before the old hotel had even finished coming down, the excavation began. Now picture this scene for a moment. In the freezing cold of a New York January, in a city gripped by economic panic, hundreds of men descended into what would become one of the most famous holes in the ground in American history. 2 shifts working around the clock, 300 men on the day shift, 300 more taking over at night, digging without pause, 12 hours at a time, day after day, night after night. Steam shovels groaned and clawed at the earth. Horses and mules hauled away cartloads of soil and stone. Picks and shovels bit into ground that had not seen sunlight in centuries. The old hotel's foundations, still partially standing in places, had to be broken apart and removed even as the excavation crews worked around them. An almost surreal scene of old and new colliding in real time. One crew still tearing down remnants of a Gilded Age palace, while another crew, mere feet away, was already digging the grave for something entirely different, something that would rise instead of crumble. The goal was to dig 55 feet down. 55 feet might not sound like much when you consider building destined to rise well over 1,000 feet into the sky, but reaching solid, dependable rock at that depth was absolutely critical. You cannot build something this heavy, something destined to hold thousands of tons of steel and stone and glass, on soft or unstable ground. It would sink, it would tilt, it would eventually collapse. The builders needed bedrock, the ancient, unmoving stone that lies beneath Manhattan's surface, the very reason skyscrapers can exist in this city at all. Manhattan sits atop something geologists call Manhattan schist, a hard, dense, metamorphic rock formed hundreds of millions of years ago, buried under intense heat and pressure deep within the Earth long before humans existed, long before dinosaurs walked this planet. In some parts of the island, this bedrock lies close to the surface. In others, it dips much deeper, hidden beneath layers of soil, sand, and clay. Engineers already understood this uneven geology reasonably well by 1930. It's part of why certain parts of Manhattan could support skyscrapers while other neighborhoods, where the bedrock sat far below the surface, could not. but knowing the rock is down there in theory, and actually digging down to touch it with your own hands, are two very different things. And that's where the trouble began. As the excavation crews dug deeper and deeper into the earth, cutting through layers of soil that had not been disturbed in generations, they ran into something nobody had fully planned for. Manhattan, despite its endless grid of concrete streets and towering buildings, still carries secrets from its natural past, and one of those secrets is water, underground streams. Hidden waterways that flow silently beneath the pavement, remnants of the island's original landscape before it was paved over and built upon, before the natural creeks and ponds that once dotted this land were buried and forgotten by the modern city growing on top of them. The excavation crew hit one of these underground streams while digging the pit. Suddenly, water was seeping, or perhaps even rushing, into a hole that was supposed to be dry, stable ground. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was a genuine problem, one that could threaten the entire schedule of the project, or worse, the structural integrity of whatever they eventually built above it. You cannot lay a stable foundation in a pit that keeps filling with water. The steel columns, the concrete footings, everything that needed to sit firmly on solid rock now faced the very real risk of resting, instead on wet, unstable ground, undermined by a stream that had been quietly flowing beneath this patch of Manhattan for longer than anyone could say. The crew's first instinct was straightforward: damn it, block the flow, hold the water back, and keep working. And for a little while this seemed to work. But underground water has a way of finding paths of least resistance, of pushing and probing at any barrier in its way, patient in a manner that no human construction crew can match. The dam did not hold. The water found a way around it, or through it, and the crews realized fairly quickly that trying to simply block this ancient stream with a temporary barrier was not going to be a permanent solution. So they changed strategy. Instead of fighting the water head-on, they decided to control it, to roof over the stream, essentially building a structure that would allow the underground water to continue flowing beneath the site without interfering with the foundation being built above it. It was an elegant solution to a problem that, on the surface, seemed almost mythical in nature, as if the city itself, or the land beneath it, was pushing back against the ambition of the men trying to build something so enormous on top of it. Imagine standing at the edge of that pit, watching workers scramble to solve a problem that had nothing to do with steel or stone or blueprints, but with something far older and far less controllable, a river that had been running beneath Manhattan since long before the first European settlers arrived, since long before there was a New York at all. It's worth pausing here to think about what that discovery really represents. Beneath one of the most modern, most ambitious construction projects in human history, a building destined to scrape the very edge of the sky, lay a piece of the island's ancient, untamed past. A hidden stream, flowing in darkness, indifferent to skyscrapers and stock markets and human ambition. For a brief moment in early 1930, that stream had the power to slow down, or even threaten, one of the most audacious building projects the world had ever attempted. And for a brief moment, the builders had to negotiate with the land itself, finding a way to work with this hidden feature of the earth, rather than simply overpowering it through brute force. Once the water issue was managed, the excavation continued at a punishing pace. Remember, this entire project was operating under a brutal deadline. The owner had insisted the building needed to be ready for occupancy by May of the following year, just 18 months after construction officially started. Every single day mattered. Every delay, whether caused by underground rivers or stubborn hotel walls that refused to come down easily, threatened to eat into a schedule that left almost no room for error. Over the following weeks, the crews removed an almost unbelievable amount of material from the site. In total, roughly 57,000 tons of earth and rock were dug out and hauled away from that pit, an amount of material so large it's difficult to fully picture. Imagine convoy after convoy of trucks and carts, day and night, hauling load after load away from Fifth Avenue, clearing the way for what would rise above it. And as the pit deepened, workers began sinking smaller pier holes into the ground at specific points across the site, carefully calculated positions where the massive concrete footings would eventually sit, footings strong enough to support columns of steel that would, in turn, support a structure heavier and taller than nearly anything ever built by human hands up to that point. By early March of 1930, the excavation was nearly complete. The pit had reached the depth the engineers needed. The underground stream had been tamed and diverted safely beneath the site. 55 feet below street level, workers stood on solid rock, Manhattan schist, hundreds of millions of years old, finally exposed to sunlight for the first time in its long, silent existence, about to become the anchor point for one of the most famous buildings ever constructed. And here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable in its ambition. The builders did not wait for the entire foundation to be finished before they began construction. On March 17, 1930, with some footings still being completed, workers placed the very first steel column of the building into position, right there on the newly poured concrete footing, even as other crews continued working nearby to finish the remaining foundation work. It was an almost audacious overlap, building upward before the ground beneath had even been fully prepared everywhere else, running two enormous phases of construction simultaneously rather than one after another, squeezing every possible day out of a brutally tight schedule. From that moment forward, the project moved with a speed that stunned even the people working on it. This was no ordinary construction site. It operated more like a finely tuned assembly line than a traditional building project. Materials arrived on precise schedules, timed almost like clockwork: limestone, steel beams, bricks, mortar, marble. Each material flowed into the site exactly when it was needed, not a day too early, not a day too late, keeping thousands of workers constantly busy without wasted time or wasted motion. Steel that had been forged in mills hundreds of miles away arrived, was hoisted into place, and riveted into position sometimes within days of leaving the factory. The building rose at a pace that felt almost impossible. At times, an entire story of the skyscraper was completed in a single day. Think about that for a moment. A single day. An entire floor of what would become the tallest building in the world, framed and riveted into place, in the time it takes most of us to get through a regular workday. This was construction happening at a velocity nobody had witnessed before, on a project that had begun its life not with steel and stone, but with a fight against an underground river flowing beneath Fifth Avenue. The workforce itself deserves its own moment in this story. At the height of construction, more than 3,500 workers were employed on the site, with as many as 3,439 men working on a single day in August of 1930. These were not anonymous, faceless laborers. They were real people, many of them Irish and Italian immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity, willing to do dangerous, back-breaking work high above the streets of Manhattan for a paycheck that could support their families. Among them was a smaller but deeply significant group of ironworkers from the Mohawk community of Carnawake, near Montreal, men whose skill and fearlessness, working at extreme heights on narrow steel beams, became legendary. A tradition of high steel work passed down through generations of Mohawk ironworkers, who would go on to help build many of New York's most famous skyscrapers in the decades that followed. This was, by any measure, dangerous work. Safety regulations in 1930 were nothing like what exists today. There was no modern harness system, no comprehensive safety net, none of the protective infrastructure that construction workers rely on now. Men walked across narrow steel beams hundreds of feet in the air with a casualness that seems almost unthinkable by today's standards, their balance and nerve the only thing standing between them and a fatal fall. Tragically, 5 workers lost their lives during the construction of the building, a sobering reminder that behind every gleaming, celebrated skyscraper lies real human risk, real human sacrifice, people whose names are rarely remembered, but whose labor is quite literally built into the structure that still stands today. And all of this, the underground river, the punishing excavation schedule, the immigrant laborers and Mohawk ironworkers risking their lives hundreds of feet in the air, the assembly line efficiency of raising a story a day, all of it was happening against the backdrop of the worst economic collapse in American history. While banks failed and unemployment soared across the country, while breadlines stretched down city blocks and families lost their homes and life savings, this single construction site in the middle of Manhattan kept moving forward, kept growing taller, day after day, defying the gloom that had settled over the rest of the nation like a fog. For the men working on it, this project wasn't just a job. For many of them, in the depths of the Depression, it was survival. A paycheck when paychecks were scarce. A reason to wake up before dawn and travel to a site where, despite everything falling apart in the wider world, something extraordinary was being built. The building rose at a pace of roughly 4.5 stories per week on average, though at its fastest, the crews managed even more astonishing rates. From the moment that first steel column was set into the ground on March 17, 1930, to the day the building was topped out, construction moved forward with barely a pause. The entire skyscraper, all 102 stories of it, plus the dramatic mooring mast at its peak, originally intended, rather fantastically, as a docking station for airships, was completed in a total of just about 410 days. 410 days start to finish, for a building that would stand as the tallest structure on the planet for the next 4 decades. When you consider that this entire journey began with an ordinary hole in the ground, a pit 55 feet deep, hiding an underground stream that briefly threatened to derail the entire project, the speed of what followed becomes almost dizzying to comprehend. The men who dug that foundation, who fought back the water, who cleared away 57,000 tons of earth and rock in the freezing cold of a New York January, had no way of knowing they were laying the groundwork, quite literally, for one of the most iconic buildings in human history. They were just trying to hit bedrock. They were just trying to solve a water problem. They were just trying to keep the schedule on track for men who were paying them to move fast and ask few questions. The building officially opened on the 1st of May, 1931, just over 18 months after that steel contract had been signed, and barely more than a year after the first excavation crews had broken ground in the freezing January cold. Ironically, because of the financial devastation still gripping the country, the building initially struggled to find enough tenants to fill its office space, leading some New Yorkers to jokingly nickname it the Empty State Building in its early years. It would take until the early 1950s for the building to actually become profitable for its owners, but its symbolic power was never in question. From the very beginning, this was a structure that represented something larger than office space or rental income. It represented resilience, ambition, the refusal to stop building even when the entire world seemed to be falling apart around you. And it all started with a hole in the ground on a cold January day, and a hidden river beneath Fifth Avenue that, for a brief moment in 1930, held the power to change the course of one of the greatest building projects in American history. Today, millions of people visit the Empire State Building every year, riding elevators up through the very steel columns that were first set into place on that footing back in March of 1930, gazing out over a city that has changed almost beyond recognition since then. Almost none of them think about what lies 55 feet beneath their feet on the ground floor, the ancient Manhattan schist bedrock that made this entire building possible, the layers of earth and clay that were hauled away truck by truck in the depths of a New York winter, or the underground stream that once flowed freely through that soil before it was carefully redirected and roofed over to make way for one of the most famous skylines in the world. But that's often how history works. The grandest achievements are usually built on top of small, forgotten struggles, a stubborn hotel that refused to come down easily, a stock market crash that threatened to derail everything, hundreds of workers laboring through freezing nights in 12-hour shifts, and yes, a hidden underground river that had been flowing quietly beneath Manhattan long before anyone thought to build a skyscraper on top of it. Every one of those obstacles could have stopped the project in its tracks. None of them did, and what rose instead, story by story, day by day, was a building that would come to define an entire city's skyline and an entire era's sense of what human ambition, even in the darkest of economic times, could accomplish when it simply refused to stop digging.